This is the bear. When I was born, I got this bear, and this was like my best friend and my autism special object. And so I'm going to talk about identity today. And identity, gosh, I like to move. Here I am, I'm going to stay in place. Okay. So identity has an interesting thing because identity appears both, indicates both the body and the embodiment of the body. And so all the things that we all are the things that we produce. Our phenotype isn't just our body presentation, but all the works that come out of us, everything we do. And so that's part of our identity. And another part of our identity is how we model that, how our mind models reality. And so where identity comes from often in the literature is the Erikson stages of psychosocial development. And so this is the typical development where it's suggested that people move through trust and they build a little bit of autonomy from that trusting relationship, and then they get initiative, and then they build whole industry. They become, and then they build an identity around their function in society, and then they move into intimacy, and then they create generativity to give to the next generations, and then they realize themselves as a complete person, and as opposed to other things like that. And so with identity, that brings us right into the central things of activity, where the activity is the central place of where identity plays out. So identity is often connected to personal identity, what I identify myself as, and then what society identifies me with. And that's called identity and negotiation, about kind of the middle way of where we're able to decide. And so that's the activities that we play, how we participate. We see there's environmental factors, that kind of constructivist things. There's personal factors, like how I decide my identity is. And then there's the differences in my body, and they all get down to how I connect. So conceptualizing identity has been seen as that we move between achievement and foreclosure and moratorium and diffusion, which means that we move from this kind of diffuse sense of identity, and then we go into kind of explore, or we can just say, you know what? It's what Jean-Paul Sartre called bad faith. I'm just going to be what everyone tells me to be, and I'm just going to foreclose on my identity, and I'll be what you want me to be. Versus achievement, which we explore, and we find that identity kind of negotiation. So the autism identity is shown in literature to actually be really beneficial when we share autism identity. So we can actually, about 50% of people with autism have like depression and anxiety, according to literature, and this can actually help reduce that, because when we are talking about identities and its acceptance, there's a certain kind of resonance. Identity masking and anticipated stigma, though, happens that when we're sharing our identity, and that's a marginalized identity, there can actually be health impacts. And so with that, what happens is identity can be masked, and there's due to anticipated stigma. Due to that, we might get harmed by others. We're anticipating some kind of ableistic interaction that's going to maybe project some kind of unfortunate memories on our kind of amygdala, I call it amygdala trauma to my students when I teach them statistics. Responses to stigmatized identities include avoidance responses. Often when people are ableistic, a person with autism will experience that emotional experience as anger and irritation and unease and pity and fear, instead of acceptance and cooperation. And so they live often in a very different emotional world. Identity interference happens when multiple identities compete. And so we have this kind of intersectionality, but sometimes the self-definition integrates together. And so someone can build all those identities, and it builds up all these kind of strengths, all these capacities. But what happens when some are marginalized and some aren't, these identities interfere and they start competing with each other. They create inner conflict, and this can bring more psychological distress. And then the ableism environment creates another level of distress. So identity centrality, which is something that has been measured typically by structured interview or self-report. These kind of show how some identities are really dear to us, and some we kind of keep at arm's length. And so for autism, I've been doing experiments to see how the kind of ramifications on psychological functioning, if someone is holding autism as a central identity or as a far-off identity, using a different method than has been used before. So this is a kind of a picture of identity centrality. You can see that autism identity might be kind of closer, and we have within a whole intersectionality. So my research uses multi-dimensional scaling to be able to locate autism amongst other kind of words that have different connotations. So we have denotations of identity, like autism, but the connotations can be, as we showed to the research, can be really positive or can be detrimental depending on the environment and what other agents that we're communicating with. And so with this, I'm also using to show how close identity is to things that would be considered maybe like here, antisocial or driven, being pressured and so on like that, versus other things that are considered like detailed and helpful and these things. And so this is in Cartesian space kind of showing that, and then also showing with measures how the impacts on the mechanisms of brain functioning work in connection. And so one of the things that shows is that when we can accept identity, we have something called stressor acceptance. The society helps us get through all the little bumps of the day. So we get kind of hits in the day and little stresses, and they kind of build up. But with social things like, hey, it's okay, you're doing great, and things, and that reduces that. It builds up our capacity to do more. But when we have a stigmatized identity, then we have added stressor and we have reduced stressor acceptance, and that harms our resilience. So this is another area that's important to my research, was identity schemas, and this idea is that we actually have different identity schemas depending if we anticipate being stigmatized or if we anticipate being accepted. In other words, we don't totally shift in our primary personality, but we have sub-schemas that contextualize our identities given in different contexts. We become different people when we're transacting with different people, depending on how we're engaging. In other words, this identity schema happens in a didactic format. What does didactic means? There's two people, it takes two people to tango. And so that we merge and we synergize identity schemas in that. And so with that, we can have offensive or defensive schemas. We can go, wow, I want to cooperate. I'm accepted as an autistic. I have certain kinds of abilities and capacities that are unique, and I want to contribute those. Or, boy, I'm really defensive, and I've got to really be careful and maybe like really take it slow. And I have a whole different things. And so mood challenges, when we get those kind of stressor events, can actually evoke these defensive identity schemas. And a lot of mindfulness, cognitive, behavioral kind of intervention is centered around this kind of concept. I started out with philosophy. My personal identity was philosopher, but I had to ego negotiate with the world and become a psychologist, kind of the middle point. I wanted to walk around in the forest with my notebooks, thinking thoughts, but society would not give me a paycheck for that yet. But here it is with Wittgenstein. I've got to add philosophy. I start with Wittgenstein when I start statistics, and people are going, am I in the right class? But we talk about how all propositions about the world are probabilistic. But I'm going to start with Wittgenstein in a different way and saying that he had a huge differential between his first book and his second book. The first book is how can we mirror the world as a model in our mind with logical precision. So how can we have a knowledge model of the world that precisely speaks to the correct root of the causal mechanisms of the world? And the second one was, you know what, all that stuff, yeah, it's accurate, but it's not a big deal in language. Language is about language games. It's about culture. It's about play. It's about two people that get together and they start acting goofy with each other. They start inventing all kinds of activities, and boom, you have a whole culture. People get more and more involved, and there's this whole robust sense of play versus our kind of model that's representative of the world. And so these two things of these two areas, we can see it in the pathological model, like a model of the mechanisms, and then the constructivist, it's a model of our cultural play. Another one is Vygotsky. Vygotsky was one of the first people with social constructivist ideas, and he said that it was connected to brain mechanisms. He suggested that our brain mechanisms actually shift in their organization, and so we not only have a different identity, but we have different brain systems coming online depending on what social cultural setting that we're in. So that we become different people with different kinds of intelligence, different capacities, depending on different social cultural environments. This connects our idea of propositional attitudes. What's interesting is propositional attitudes mean that there's all these components of the brain, all these mechanisms that interact with language. We have an affinity with language. Try it out. Try spending a whole day without just having to look at a piece of paper and connect with language, or how we work together with language and we connect. And this means that we connect our mental states, how we experience our world, with always interacting with language and becoming different through this kind of social fabric. And this has the directions of fit as how I am interpreting the world and how the world is interpreting me. And that language game is being played out. So what is the brain mechanisms that we're talking about? I like to say that it's just a simple one. And there can be lots of brain mechanisms, but there's inputs, there's some kind of algorithmic process or relation, and then we create outputs. And so we can kind of conceptualize brain mechanisms having this kind of feature. And so we can imagine that ourselves is an aggregate of brain mechanisms, and other agents are aggregate of brain mechanisms, and we have this didactic language in which we're shaping each other and changing each other's schema and each other's functioning within some kind of common environment. What I'm going to suggest is the autistic common environment isn't invented yet completely, and that this is where a lot of our issues are within the neurodiversity movement. So to understand our brain mechanisms in a very simple, fast way, I'm just going to kind of introduce some ideas that I've had to kind of simplify all of psychology in the 15 minutes I have left. Tolving created these three different levels of consciousness: the autonoetic, the noetic, and the anoetic. And so I had this idea that these are three different consciousnesses, but they're three different qualitatively different kind of consciousnesses. That when we're having episodic memory and we're simulating our past or counterfactual realities or futures, that's the episodic autonoetic. And the semantic is when we know stuff, when we're modeling stuff with knowledge, and we know like this is a cup and a proposition with water, et cetera, that we know things, that's another. When we know things in the present, that's another kind of consciousness. So the noetic is always now looking at knowledge, and the autonoetic is going all over time, mental time traveling, but the anoetic, which is considered procedural, I suggest is also emotional. Because when we're moving, it's an emotional experience. We have social, motor feedback. We have other kind of feedback. So when we're feeling, we think, oh, that's just affect. But what if feeling was a consciousness? What if it was such a weird, different quality of consciousness that we didn't accept it, that we were actually consciously aware of what we feel and think, and in their movement with each other, biological motion that's going with those feelings. What if that's a consciousness? And what if we know things about each other and we say, I know this about this, and we know about this, that's another kind of consciousness. And when we go in our dreams and our aspirations and we invent creativity, that's another kind of consciousness. And so we have these kind of rapid, fast salience, valiances, effect. We're orienting to other valiances, and we have embodied connections. Our body's already moving with the world and transacting with objects. We have this emotional presence that we can feel all the time, emotional presence. Our instincts and our urges are alive in that emotional presence. We have a vigilance. We're always aware of what not to expect. And that can be all Pavlovian conditioned. And then it kind of connects with these survival circuits. So we might have a sub-schema for defense, and another one for controlling our energy and nutrition and fluid balance and thermoregulation and procreative urges. And that connects with our sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems that we're always in kind of a balance between stress and rest. And then our noetic task system, this kind of fast, long-term memory that I'm Joseph and I work here and I know all these different things and I always I'm an optimal policy and boy, I've had a good morning. I've been doing everything in the right order and I'm this and that. And I have self-referential. I have consciousness of I. I'm egoic. I use a lot of crystal intelligence. Boy, I know a lot of facts. And I have executive functions, so I can really control things. And I can be controlling of other people too. And I can be goal-driven. And so, boy, I can meet my goals, and I can suit my identity towards that. And that also is incredibly shaped by instrumental conditioning, socially regulated. And so we have this autonoetic metacognitive system. And that's when we slow down. We start reflecting. And a lot of the literature is saying that when we're reflecting, we need some kind of trigger. So we have an experience, something comes to mind or something is experienced, and all of a sudden we have this thoughtful reflection. We get these new ideas, the kind of philosopher stuff. This fluid intelligence, we can actually generalize some concepts to other metaphors. We can have humor and all kinds of things. And this is socially connected too, because it was supervised learning, and it's often supervised learning from our own internal talk. So these are kind of these thoughtful reflections I really value, that are philosophical reflections. So a lot of buzzwords, like kind of the difference between narrow artificial intelligence, which we have now, it's machine learning, which is a lot like long-term memory, semantic. And then there's this idea of artificial general intelligence, which is what some people are very afraid of. Some people might make good electric cars. But a lot of the experts say it's like 80 years away or something like that, or maybe not even possible. And this is the one that would change everything a huge amount. But what if this general intelligence was right here in the room right now, that we all have fluid intelligence? And this is a general intelligence that is something that is untapped, and that we have an autistic general intelligence that might even have other capability. So something kind of like a lot of autistic people or autistic-like people were working on 2001: A Space Odyssey, and then we have this idea of this anoetic arising with all these urges until there needs to be some kind of regulation of those urges, and then so the noetic comes in. Oh, I can control urges, and then all of a sudden I'm going to keep us on mission, and then all of a sudden Hal is taking over everything, and everyone is afraid for their lives, and then we pass that stage into the autonoetic at the end, where all of a sudden we can realize our own context. We can create niche constructions of our own environments. That environment in which we transact can be totally new, that autistic people can create new autistic environments that are more slow process. Because consider that people are having, for me, I have these sensory overwhelms. So I have sensory overwhelms, and what happens is that during those sensory overwhelms, I realize that I'm actually slow. I'm actually autonoetic. That the noetic is fast, and so noetic people are like, I'm going to go fast, 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 and they handle all these stimuli. But when I'm trying to go fast, fast, fast with all the stimuli, I'm just like, whoa. But when I slow down and I keep it there, all of a sudden the reflective thoughts come naturally. I'm moving out of psychological distress into using my general intelligence. I'm entering beginner's mind versus I know who I am and I have all this kind of crystal intelligence. That's a Zen concept. That I'm realizing my original face, my autonoetic face consciousness. That the autonoetic has a kind of connected to the mirror neurons face, that interfacial expressions, we have a synergy. So in the neurodiversity movement, there's a lot of talk about, is autism a disability or not a disability? Well, I suggest thinking about it as that they're just two different identities. And so there's autism and disability. So I have a disability and I have autism. And how do those intersect? For me, is a more interesting question than is it, are they the same or not? Language of empathy as a triadic of resonance. So we can actually resonate between these three consciousnesses. It's called empathic resonance. And this is where we find empathy gaps and so on. So what happens is that we recognize, if we can get into compassion, empathy, we can actually start mirroring, like an energetic body mirroring each other with our facial expressions into resonance, so we can connect. That's the opposite of the ableistic identity schema. And we can start recognizing the common suffering that we all are in, to our common humanity. And we can have that, we can regulate negative feelings with that empathy called empathic distress together. So some people, we feel empathy for another, and we go, whoa, that's too needy. I can't handle it. I'm really stressed out about that. That's someone that's very empathic, but they're having empathic distress. Versus empathic resonance, it's like, I'm here for you, like we're alive. So I want to get through to, I don't want to go to too many concepts here, but I want to say that theory of mind is really connected with this autonoetic consciousness, and that a lot of the literature says that theory of mind may be impacted with autism, but I'm suggesting that we might have a different type of theory of mind. So theory of mind is when we simulate someone else in our mind. We use autonoetic consciousness to be able to imagine someone else. You can either put ourselves in their shoes, but what if autistics are using that same thing, but instead of another agent, we might have another idea or concept or another mechanisms, because an aggregate of mechanisms and an agent can be similar. So what if we're using that to create new worlds with creativity that can't be understood by a narrow intelligence, narrow artificial intelligence? So we have narrative introspection, which is really big for me, which is a story. And so I want to kind of go over a little bit of story. So here's our mirror neuron system. It's very automatic. It's actually mediated by this fast categorical thinking, so it's mediated by how we categorize with our noetic consciousness. But if we can get perspective taking, use autonoetic consciousness with each other, it actually reduces that impact, and then it opens up this idea of resonance, such as listening to our stories, which we're doing today. I want to go over just a few ideas of what we can do. We can use mindfulness, and we can use psychoeducation to understand our own minds. We can understand the impact of empathic distress. And we can also understand that things like sympathy and egoism are not the same as autism. And that we have to do, we're all doing emotional labor. So when we create an identity, we're having to do the anoetic impact of having our emotions in that identity. And sometimes it fits and sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes we have surface acting, which we're like, I'm just trying to get through my job, it's horrible, but I'm doing it, and we're just surface acting. Sometimes we're deep acting. We can really feel empathy for people when we're working with them. And then there's just our regular natural emotion. And so what we're trying to do is trying to shape new environments that shape deep acting with positive roles for people with autism. And so that's the kind of the nature of the empathy gaps. We want to kind of bridge those empathy gaps by creating stories and interpersonal dynamics in group and out group differentiations kind of getting minimized. Autistic slow environments as niche construction. So I think this is and so what we've tried to do is we've tried to really focus on things like the autism's own, which is to create autism's own environments, autism's own culture. The identity and the culture fit together. Find transition programs to bring autistic people safely to the other side of when they can feel proud of their identity and function in roles with deep acting emotionally, and have employment activities. And so I've also developed this Authors with Autism as I think maybe one of the first peer support groups designed by people with autism. And we started authoring our own lives, authoring our own environments. We created Autism's Own as an extension of that concept. And we've had conferences for 6 years, and we have these journals out, and it's this idea of that back to the beginning, that we have this identity and we have this particle wave duality. So our identities, it isn't just that we have a diffused identity and that's bad. Thank you. And then we have this focal identity, which is good. The noetic identity is great, and anoetic or autonoetic, that's kind of abstract. But that there's this kind of play in between two, that particles and waves are just two kind of natures. And so my first, my only article that I wrote in this journal, Autism's Own journal, was this one little concept. And this one little concept is that if Einstein physics says that space and time are one thing and cannot be separated, meaning that from the very beginning of the universe to the very end, it's one a series of space-time events. And outside of that, you can measure the nothing, and the nothing can be either no time, So non-temporal, or Hawking just released a fun thing as a posthumous note that it could be imaginary time, which is when time turns to space and space turns to time. But at the same time, if it was imaginary time, that means that moment would be only one moment, perpendicular. So that means that space-time would be encapsulated by no time. It would not be able to ever go. So we know that energy cannot disappear. It means that everything that we're in right now, this day, everything, we're here forever. And so this is an idea. If we can understand that there's a possibility that we're in eternal time, that every minute we're stuck in forever, and we can learn to really build something incredible with it, with our creativity, our autonoetic consciousness can create new worlds, then I thought maybe it could add to the power of bringing people together. Another idea is that in science is that all of life has this common ancestor, Luca. And so I think I'm a member of Luca. I have a connection or empathic resonance to all life. And so that all life is connected eternally in this time. So how are we creating new spaces? I've helped design this $28 million autism building, and I just had notes like this. This is reflective philosophical thoughts, and it turns into the idea of a skyward, autism going up this circle, this circular thing out into good space to have a good life. And that there's hidden space, autism's own space, so kids could go into these little niches and they could have their own space in these big buildings. And they created them. I also create music because everything's signal to noise, and just noise doesn't help by itself. And so we create a certain kind of noise that brings our thought that we can focus on real thought. And so just to finish things off, this is our cart, and we're starting with the kids. We're just starting with play, movement, and science, and connection. And so that they know and this kind of, going out to schools and understanding that our emotions. And we're having a Let's Face It app so that if kids are too overstimulated to see the face, to see the eternity of face-to-face, the original face to others, that they can take an app and they can look at that later when they're not overstimulated. Because once again, we remember, this is something I wrote a long time ago, once one remembers one's original face, one forgets all else. When we remember that we can resonate all these consciousnesses together and we can connect together, we can niche construct our own environments, and the autistics can create a world in which we can say that spaces here are truly autism's own. Thank you.
The UC Davis Mind Institute was created in 1998 with a promise to find cures for neurodevelopmental disorders. Every day, our physicians and researchers come closer to fulfilling that promise. Their groundbreaking research on autism, Fragile X syndrome, chromosome 22q11.2 deletion syndrome, ADHD, and other brain disorders are helping children achieve their fullest potential. Please visit our website to find out more about current studies, upcoming events, and how you can help make a difference.